Commencement, the beginning of a new era in higher education by Kate Colbert and Joe Salustio with contributions by Elvin Freites is now available for pre-order on Amazon. Get your Kindle edition or your softbound book. It's going to be
amazing.
Welcome back, everybody. It's your time to EdUp on the EdUp Experience podcast, where we make education your business. Dr. Joe Salustio back with you on another episode of EdUp as we fast approach 200 presidents interviewed, 200,000 downloads. Can't wait to pass 500 total episodes. And of course, we're writing a book called Commencement, the beginning of a new era in higher education, available now for pre-order on Amazon. We're going to give you all the tips, ideas, and insights from over 100 college and university presidents that we've interviewed on this podcast. It's going to be incredible. Thank you for your support. I'll try to stop the self-promotion just long enough to introduce my co-host here with me today. We're going to have another great episode. You've heard him before, ladies and gents, and you'll hear him again because he's scheduled into the future on a bunch of episodes. Here he is. He's Jeffrey Roche, and he is Senior Vice President at Core Education. Jeffrey, welcome back.
Thanks, Joe. Good to see you.
I feel like I just saw you the other day. You were on the other day with me, right? We did one the other day.
I was, but the question is, did I have hair then or not?
No, I can't remember. But you didn't have your EdUp mug, but I think you have your EdUp co-hosting mug now.
I do have my co-hosting mug. I don't have it here right now with me, but
well, that's bad. You know, we got to work on that branding representation when you do these, Jeffrey. We'll have to talk after. But I'm excited to have you back. Absolutely, you have so many great insights on what's happening in higher ed, and we have somebody with us that's doing incredible work and really an innovative model, a piece of innovation that I haven't seen anybody else do anything like it. So we're going to bring him in. We're going to let him just go to town and tell us all about it. Here he is, ladies and gentlemen. His name is David Helene, and he is CEO at Edquity. David, what's happening?
Hey, Joe. Thrilled to be here, and thank you so much for having me.
Well, we're glad to have you because you're doing pretty awesome work that hasn't been done or nobody's doing, or at least not in the way you are. Let's level set. The audience is sitting here going, Edquity, let me look that up. But let's hear it from David. What is Edquity? What do you do? How do you do it?
Yeah, absolutely. So the fundamental problem that we're focused on is the fact that about 50% of students deal with issues like food or housing insecurity across the country. Those are actually sales statistics that are pre-inflation, pre-pandemic, right? So we know that these issues are getting much worse. And they also intersect the fact that financial issues are the number one reason that students are either unenrolling or fail to matriculate to post-secondary classrooms. So our work at Edquity is fundamentally focused on streamlining access to approximate social safety net to make sure that students have the financial resources they need to be successful. And that primarily takes the form of emergency cash grants. So we are right now the only end-to-end administrator of emergency cash grants or emergency aid to students, where we have an application, a decision, a payment, and a reporting apparatus for partners, where we have administered about $150 million to students in the last year, and on average, 25 hours from application. So we are getting money to students within the time horizon that they need to deal with either getting their water utility bill shut off, or if they're facing an eviction proceeding. We get them the money they need to stay enrolled and to stay successful and get their credential.
Okay, so was this a pandemic-born business, David? Did you tell me a little bit about the story? Because, of course, when you go right to it, if you're listening to this, you go, oh, wow, this would have been, did the pandemic create the need for this type of business? Were you working on it beforehand? Talk a little bit about the formation of the Edquity idea.
Yeah, absolutely. So this actually wasn't born in the pandemic. It was certainly accelerated during the pandemic. But the problem statement that I laid out, financial induced dropout, right, structural basic needs challenges that students are facing, this has actually been an issue for decades, right? And to the credit of post-secondary institutions, for the last decade or so, they've sort of been re-engineering themselves as social services entities in many ways, right? So they've been standing up things like food pantries, voucher programs. They've been installing caseworkers on campuses, and they've been building these sort of grassroots emergency aid programs, where they've had these cash grant programs for students to try to catch them when they fall financially and make sure that they don't drop out. But as you can imagine, post-secondary institutions, they are not necessarily set up to be the most nimble, right? They are not set up to be able to review applications, to do so in a way that is often not stigmatizing or doing what we call requiring students to perform poverty. It's really burdensome to staff. It also, really creates a lot of secondary trauma for folks, and having to read all of these applications talking about all of the tremendous hardships that students are facing. And most importantly, they do it too slowly, right? So even though they've been standing up these programs, the average time to get cash out was 13 days from application,
Yikes!
right? And if I'm about to get pushed out of my home, or I'm about to see my utility shut off, or I can't get to school because I don't have access to transportation, these are all time-sensitive issues that require payment today. So we actually had built Edquity in 2019. We did do our first partnership in the wake of a natural disaster. So we did face tremendous volume and scale quite quickly. But our launch in 2019 in partnership with Dallas College was helped prepare us for the incremental rapid scaling that was required in 2020 onward, right? So the CARES Act and the subsequent two stimulus bills infused $32 billion of federal funding into the system, directly geared toward emergency student aid to try to help students weather the pandemic. So we have seen tremendous growth and scale over the last couple of years, but the problem statement actually preceded the pandemic and will continue onward even after these federal funds have been exhausted.
Fantastic.
Let me ask one more real quick one, Jeffrey, before you jump in. And David, you said something that I think it needs to be restated because it's so true, but the way you said it was perfect. And I'm going to say what that is, but I'm going to tell you, last week I was interviewing a college and a university president, a community college president, and she goes, and she was retiring at the end of this year, and she goes, never in my time as presidency did I think I'd end up in the food business. They have 4 pantries on their campus. They extended from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, and the services around basic needs. And I thought that comment was just mind blowing when you think about it. Universities are social service agencies in many ways, have had to be because of the learning loss. There's learning loss, and when you have learning loss, then you're behind on where you wanted to be, which means your basic services are, there's internet access and food and water and all these things that have come up, and colleges we weren't in the business of that, but now we are, and it's kind of like this weird spot.
That's totally right. I mean, it's really remarkable what I've seen community college presidents in particular do, right? Folks who are literally standing in physical locations, handing out laptops at the beginning of the pandemic for students, right? As we were transitioning to remote environments, mailing out hotspots, like you said, becoming experts in sort of, the food business and food supply. It speaks really to some of the policy failures, quite candidly, on how we are making students paid for and finance their education. And also the lack of sort of access to affordable cost of living around college campuses, right? We've seen just in the last year alone, rent prices have increased 14%, food prices have increased 11%, right? The cost of living just to survive is so high these days that students are really struggling to make ends meet. So I give institutions a lot of credit, right? Because they're not really financed to provide these supports to students, and yet they're trying to do the most with the least.
Interesting. Jeffrey.
David, impressive work. But what I'm really curious about, because I didn't hear you share this, but what led you personally to want to start this? Is there a story part of that you would be willing to share? Because obviously,
Sure.
To me, there's a mission behind it, and I'm just curious about what led you to that mission.
Yeah, absolutely. So I started my career doing what I would deem to be the opposite of what I do today, which is that I was a bank lobbyist. So I was lobbying on behalf of the largest financial institutions in the country around capital and liquidity regulations, and found myself quite quickly wanting to really advocate for and support many of the communities that are historically disenfranchised by those institutions. So, 2013, I started a nonprofit organization that was focused on the intersection of financial capability and ongoing sort of wealth building. But for a student audience, I was thinking, what is actually a practicable experiential learning point for a student who's in high school and set on sort of the college education decision? And this was at the time in sort of 2012, 2013, where we were really starting to have these bigger conversations about student debt. And whereas, when I first started that journey and thinking about, student debt avoidance, what I sort of began to understand as I was in the classroom with students, helping them try to forecast what their college experience might cost, is that the cost of living that is advertised by a college campus versus what is experienced by students is often about 30% off, right? So as a student, I could go through a perfect financial planning exercise and find myself fundamentally insolvent, right? And given how financial aid is allocated, right, and what is allowed and with regards to plus loans and subsidized loans, unsubsidized loans, maximum allowances, the students I was working with, right, these are students in Title I high schools, low-income students, largely on free and reduced lunch. The sort of calculus was that either you can get into some of the quote unquote like top 100 schools that will give you a quote unquote free ride, right? Or you have to go to CUNY. And I say CUNY because I operate in Brooklyn, New York. That's where I was born and raised and currently reside. Right. And that's not really a choice. That's a false choice. That is, you are forced to go to an institution that is proximate because of the cost that you have to sort of internalize and grapple with. Right. And if that's the case, then this becomes two things, right? It becomes a case where this is a policy failure. And over time, you have to structurally advocate for policy reform. But in the short term, knowing that students are matriculating, you need to figure out how you streamline access to the safety net. Because for so many of these students, it's going to be an inevitable need, right? For perhaps no fault of their own, they're going to need access to a food pantry, right? They may need access to a housing voucher. They may need some sort of social work support or mental health support. So that was sort of the learning journey that I went on, and I ran that organization for a couple of years. I first took vacation time to run summer programs, then finally left to run that nonprofit in the full-time capacity for 18 months, and that journey led me to start Edquity.
That's helpful to hear because it speaks to sort of the personal mission that you bring. It's really interesting because when you look at your background, Yale graduate, coming into the space of really establishing equity. I'm curious, from your humble beginnings at Yale, how have you used that where many people would probably subscribe to the fact that is not normally an institution that would historically have equity, particularly among the student body. But I'm curious, if you can share a little bit from that, because obviously education continues to change. Yeah. And equity, equity is, transcends everything. But I'm just curious about that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think some of my experience at Yale influenced how I think about these issues, right? Is that, talent is universal, opportunity is not. And the opportunity for the folks who could go to Edquity, to Yale, yes, certainly there were, some low-income students at school, but it wasn't from a lack. It wasn't because of ability that the majority of the population was not from low-income backgrounds, right? It was due to broader structural trends. And we as a society disproportionately focus on national narratives related to Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, when the reality is that community colleges, open enrollment institutions, like those are the institutions that are really providing the next generation of the labor market, right? Is making us competitive as a country, is actually going to be responsible for narrowing equity gaps over time. So,
yes.
It's not to say I didn't have a tremendous experience at Yale, but I did have my eyes opened about sort of what the structural breakdown of post-secondary education is on the other side of it, right? So it's not to say that I have bad things to say about my alma mater, but I do think we spend way too much time focused on Yale and other institutions like Yale, because for us to solve a lot of these sort of national issues that we're facing, it's to make sure that the other institutions are funded correctly, right? It's to make sure that students at other institutions are receiving the education they need in a way that allows them to complete, right? To make sure that their basic needs are covered and that financially they're not worried about their ability to get their next meal, or if they're going to be safely housed or sheltered. So that's sort of how I think about my alma mater in context of the work that we're doing.
Commencement, the beginning of a new era in higher education, by Kate Colbert and Joe Salustio, with contributions by Elvin Freites, is now available for pre-order on Amazon. Get your Kindle edition or your softbound book. It's going to be
amazing.
It's a good reminder because I think it's 2% of students are enrolled in the Ivy League. It's like some really small percentage.
Exactly.
98% of students are enrolled in other types of institutions.
That's exactly right.
So when you're talking, we do, the amount of attention that we can bring to institutions that represent the smallest number of students is pretty amazing when you look at how the infrastructure is built around that, U.S. News World and Report rankings and all these things. But we don't talk about the other 98%, right, as much as we should. And that's what Edquity does. It helps the 98% of people that are going to need, that are I don't know, what working learners or have these considerations that maybe the 2% don't have that are attending Ivy League. What I find interesting, and I went through this too, David, my last institution was all master's degrees. So you're talking about people who are working, that are making income and leveling up. But we had, when the pandemic hit, we did the whole pandemic fund thing, emergency funds, and we funded it and we got some money in, and people, had lost jobs and were asking for this or asking for that. The amount of staff time we put into it, of how to organize it, who would be eligible, how would we decide on who gets it, and was the decision-making process equitable, and who should be involved, and how often do we need to meet? And and we did distribute it, but the time from when need hit to distribution of money and the amount of staff time that went into it, an important issue, right? It's not like it's unimportant to put staffing and resources into something that's going to help you retain your students and give them something. But the amount of staff time that went in just for a little bit of money was massive, incredibly massive. There's a data-driven piece of Edquity, right? Where you can distribute and measure outcomes and reduce the overall staff attention.
That's absolutely right. And, to your point, it's good to put staff resources on initiatives that are important, but there's a massive opportunity cost to the exercise that you just described, right? I mean, these are trained, experienced, empathetic professionals who could otherwise be student facing, right? Doing higher leverage work that is also data-driven work. And that is where we come in, right? So we have built an application that has a decision-making framework that is grounded in some of the best practice research on the issue of student basic needs and security. So the way that we actually assess students is based on components related to housing, food, transportation, childcare, physical and mental wellness, access to learning resources, as well as other variables about how the funds might impact them, right? Particularly when you're dealing with a scarce resource environment. We want to make sure that the resources are going to be deployed in such a way that they're actually going to be able to move the needle on the issue area in question, right? And we're able to do that and create apples to apples decision making for students, right? And also alleviate staff from having to get in this committee structure or meet biweekly or pour over applications, right? In fact, we can make this data actionable so that instead, what that time is spent toward is actually reaching out to and connecting with students about the known issue areas that they're experiencing, right? So in doing it in that way, we've been able to get cash assistance out to the students that represent the greatest amount of need, but in a way where the funds are actually able to touch the issue areas they're experiencing and do that in about 25 hours time. So,
and it's not just about distribution of money, because there's a retention piece to this, right? You when somebody has something happen, they tend to use that as a justification for why they can't continue with school. It doesn't matter what something is, and it doesn't matter how much it is. Sometimes it just matters that it is. And you go, I have this thing. I just can't do school right now. It's too much. And so it's not as if this technology, Edquity, is being added and there's no ROI. There is ROI. There is retention. There's enrollment. There's all these pieces that pay for itself when you use a technology like this. Can you talk about how you measure that ROI and how you communicate that to colleges and universities?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we run a number of research experiments with partners. One that was actually a regression discontinuity exercise in a randomized environment. And we found that students that have been funded by Edquity have graduated at twice the rate as those that were not funded, right? We've also run separate study. That was at Compton College with an award size of about $250. We've run similar exercises with partners that include Southern New Hampshire and others that have found anywhere from 3 percentage point to 11 percentage point semester over semester improvements in student retention, right? So
wonderful.
These are material improvements. Now, granted, you could argue that the exercise of giving cash to students, Edquity or not, should yield an ROI. But one of the only studies that has been rigorously assessed in the space was a randomized control trial run at Tarrantine Community College. And what they found is that emergency aid did not have any impact on student completion, right? And the argument that we would make is that this is because of the means of administration, right? The policy instrument is correct. The deployment of emergency aid is correct, but the way you do it matters, right? The speed with which you do it matters, the assessment framework with which you do it matters. And that's why we think we're able to tangibly deliver value to our partners. If you look at a comp, or if you look at an analog, right, you can look at programs like emergency rental assistance or unemployment insurance, right? And certainly those programs are critical. We know that rental assistance has been so needed for keeping, literally millions of families in their homes during the pandemic. But for months, the dollars fundamentally couldn't get out, right? So that was the correctly prescribed policy instrument, but if the money is not getting where it needs to go, of course it's going to have a no effect, right? So as we think about these programs, the administration or the infrastructure of that administration really matters. And we actually view ourselves as an infrastructural service, right? Like we are infrastructure for when you need to administer various programs year over year. And once it's set up, and you have that infrastructure and you're well positioned to get your students the support that they need. I always,
Jeffrey, I want to bring you back in, but I want to say how that's great, right? Because I always talk about how the student and their life moves faster than higher ed moves. And we're one of the businesses that doesn't talk enough about how we can move as fast as the student. You talk about retail shopping, they move as fast as the consumer. You can boom, 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 do anything you want. Higher ed, we don't just go, oh, wow, this committee is really slow, we should not have it. We don't do that. We try to justify why we should have it. And Jeffrey, I know you talk about the health system a lot being also sometimes a little slower than it should be, but the student and the consumer move fast and they expect fast results.
Yeah, absolutely. David, I'm curious though, as obviously I saw when you first received your seed funding, one of the things that was referenced was a study that you were doing with WGU. And I'm curious to hear a little bit of what you've learned from that, because obviously WGU has been a more innovative player in this higher education space with phenomenal results and a plethora of impact. But I'm also curious, as part of that, if you can share around, there's a difference at times when you work with a community college and you work with a public institution and then you work with a private. And
sure,
I am the first to say that I think there's a misnomer in our society that only wealthy kids go to private higher education.
Sure.
Because actually, if you break down the data, generally liberal arts, private higher education institutions actually have more students of need than some publics. And it's really interesting. Sure. And I'm just curious if there's anything from an insights perspective you can share that you've learned in your work. I know there's kind of a lot of questions in there, and Joe's like, oh boy, here he goes. But I'm just curious from your perspective there.
Yeah, those are all great questions. I mean, to your point, WGU is one of the more innovative institutions in the country, right? It's sort of, it's emblematic in how they've grown and supported students. The research design of that changed over time because we were just going to get that off the ground when the pandemic kicked up. So we found more qualitative insights and quantitative insights in doing research work with them, and found that one of the key insights was that students who were delivered emergency aid had a tremendously greater affinity for the institution, right? They felt supported, right? They felt that there was a culture of care for them. So that was a really interesting insight that we got from the survey design that we were doing in our partnership with WGU. The private-public divide that you mentioned is I think, quite fascinating, right? There is this national perception of demographic composition of these institutions. I think in some form and fashion that sometimes translates to the institutions themselves, right? Because we've actually found that we've had a lot more traction with community colleges. Certainly that makes sense because of the demographics of who is attending community colleges, right? You're typically dealing with quote unquote non-traditional. I have no idea what that word means anymore, but larger populations of adult learners. We work with a lot of MSIs and institutions that are disproportionately serving Latinx students as well as Black students. And we're starting to see more recognition among four-year institutions as well, right? So private and public. So we now have about 5 four-year institution partners one of which is a private. And I think, Jeffrey, the dynamic that you shared is one that they're starting to realize as well, right? Is that they are seeing a material sort of scope of need among the student population that they're serving. And a lot of these partnerships are early information gathering exercises for our partners, right? They're starting to take a step back and say, we think that there actually might be a lot of need here, right? But they don't have a lot of data collection infrastructure for understanding how many of their students are dealing with issues like food insecurity or housing insecurity. So one of our theories of change, right, is that we can not only move the needle on outcomes and sort of student success, but we can collect the data necessary to sort of bear out the scale and scope of the problem that we're dealing with, right? And in doing so, we can advocate for and justify incremental investments, not only into more emergency aid. And we have seen, state-based investments in the last couple of years in Washington and California into emergency aid. We've seen federal proposals for steady state emergency aid in both the Senate and the House. So, we think that we are a good mechanism for justifying those legislative efforts, but also helping institutions in the short term incrementally, push their advancement departments to build out bigger funds, right? To attract resources for the institution in the short term. So I think as we've presented data to our partners, they've sort of become a little bit wider eyed and said, oh, this may be more of an issue than we thought, right? And I think that is emblematic of what's going on across the country, because if you look at the cost of living across the country, it's going up. If you look at the cost of tuition across the country, it's going up. And the federal financial aid system is not changing that rapidly. Joe, to your point, cost of living is changing much faster than higher education is adapting to policy. So I think you're right. Whereas before this might have been a quote unquote public problem, perhaps it's not anymore, right? And private institutions and students who are attending these institutions are experiencing many of these issues as well.
100%.
You want to follow that up, Jeffrey, or you want me to jump in on you? No.
No, the only thing that not really a question, but David, well, I guess it is a question as I think about it, but, I'm curious, in your work.
You realize that your question was a question just out of curiosity?
Us academics do that all the time.
Okay, go ahead. I was looking for a reason to hit my incorrect button, but go ahead.
I know. I appreciate it. David, and now you almost made me forget my question, but my question is, when you worked with these institutions, I'm curious about particularly the intersection that you found with community benefit organizations. And I'm kind of referring there to, the Find Helps, the Unite Us, which obviously is, started right in your backyard as well. I'm curious about if you've seen kind of intersection synergies there around your work and their work and how they come together to support students, because I know there's been an increase of their work with higher ed as well.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, we actually have partnered with Find Help, and within our technology, we actually represent the resource environment for students in partnership with them. So, candidly, the intersection with access to public benefits now is inseparable, right? And this is a very interesting movement within post-secondary education that is underway, is how do you enroll students into more public benefit programs, right? Because if we're not financing education correctly so that there are student success line items, well, it turns out that the biggest student success line items are the traditional social safety net, right? Is how do you get students access to more, food and housing dollars? It actually could be through the safety net itself. So we know the state of Colorado just passed a bill to actually enroll more students into public benefits, and they have a really ambitious interagency initiative underway to try to figure out how can we more intelligently enroll students into public benefits. I know the state of Washington is trying to think about how they can create more intersection with their financial aid system and public benefit system. And you're seeing legislation in states like California, Oregon, Illinois, where they're actually installing a new role called a basic needs coordinator to make sure that students can access proximate resources around their campuses, including public benefits. So this work deeply intersects. One of our partners, United Way of King County, has a benefits hub that is installed on 11 community college campuses across the King County region. So more and more, we're seeing this intersection. It's critical. It's, like Joe, like you said, community college presidents are becoming experts in food. They're also becoming experts in navigating their local community and building these partnerships, right? Dallas College and the city of Dallas have just tremendous matrix of community-based partnerships to represent these unique types of supports for students. So it's critical. It's really nuanced work. There's not a cookie cutter approach, right? Because you're really doing place-based, community-based partnership building, partnership development. But it is a huge effort that we see underway.
Edquity has, you got like what, 40 employees or a shade under 40? I was looking at your team. You got a big team, man. Congratulations on your growth.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
What did we not say about Edquity today that you'd like to bring up, David? Was there anything in particular that you wanted to say on this podcast and Jeffrey just didn't do a good job of asking you the question? Although I didn't ask you either, I guess, apparently, if you have something. But usually I like to blame it on my co-host. And then, so anything you want to say about Edquity, anything, website, anything coming up, releases that you have? And then secondarily to that, tell me what you think the future of higher education is going to look like.
Yeah, for sure. So I sort of have two things there, and I won't blame Jeffrey for either. But one is
where's my incorrect button?
One is during the pandemic, what we saw from institutions around deployment of emergency aid is they were really valuing distribution at scale the most, right? So how do we prioritize speed at scale? And when you do that, you're really moving towards like automation, right? Seeding agency, seeding control. When you're returning now to a more scarce resource environment, right? You want to be able to couple the best of both worlds, right? When you're trying to process hundreds of thousands of applications, you can't necessarily engage in case management, right? But when you're processing tens or hundreds, you certainly can, right? And you can take advantage of best-in-class technology with best-in-class practitioner knowledge. So one of the things we've done is we've actually adapted our technology to lead with case management, right? Where we're making recommendations for partners based on what we know about students, right? Where if they want to accept our automation, they can, but we're also giving a lot of agency back. So we're actually releasing our new case management version of our product this year, which we're really excited about. And I think there are a lot of exciting opportunities for how, Jeffrey, to your point, we're really connecting the work more to the proximate resource environment. So that is something that is actually being released this fall. The other piece, though, is that we actually, recognize that the problem statement of application, verification, decision, payment, reporting, it describes not just, aid in education, but every cash assistance program that local and state government are responsible for. And we've actually begun to support local and state government across the country in the administration of various programs, including emergency rental assistance, water utility assistance programs, right? So we're actually directly supporting government. And our vision and our hope is that we can marry these two verticals, right? That we can actually be directly enrolling students into public benefits over time. And that will require place-based coordination, right? State coordination, system coordination, interagency data sharing agreements, and it's ambitious work. But the end goal, right, is how can you reduce friction for students? How can you restore dignity in application processes, right? How can you make it as easy as possible to get students the support that they need? So
amazing.
Those are sort of two of the big things here. And then I guess, Joe, to answer your question about the future of education, I mean, I'm certainly concerned about the rising cost of living without aggressive structural policy reform on the front end. And I think that's reflected in the tremendous loss of student enrollment that we've seen over the last 2 years, right? I think we've seen a 4 percentage point decline year over year, and that's much more pronounced, not just at community colleges, but among Black students in particular, right? So the equity implications of the direction of higher education today is really concerning. So I think students are going to continue to opt for these sort of shorter, cheaper pathways that are more flexible, right? I think that's why you see institutions like Southern New Hampshire, Western Governors doing really well because their value proposition right now in an environment where cost is just out of control, right? And there's so many factors that students are grappling with in their lives. They need as much flexibility and the cheapest and shortest pathway to credential attainment that will meaningfully translate into some form of employment outcome. So, I'm hopeful for policy reform over time, and I think that will certainly restore a lot of these loftier ROI conversations or the value proposition of post-secondary education, but certainly concerned about many of the trends that I'm seeing in the short term.
That's awesome, man. Well, this has been incredible to learn about Edquity, the work that you're doing to support higher education. I encourage everybody to reach out to David. If you have emergency fund distribution that you're monitoring in a manual or spreadsheet kind of way, you need technology, or else you're going to just be wasting staff dollars on that stuff. Important work, but a lot of work goes into managing something like that. First, let me thank my co-host. He's Jeffrey Roche. He's Senior Vice President, Core Education. Jeffrey, as always, thank you, my friend, for being entertained or entertaining, depending on what you think about the podcast. But I always love you having you here to co-host.
Absolutely, it's always entertaining. But let me just say that Edquity's work really needs to be applauded, particularly because of the commitment to equity.
No, thank you, Jeff. We appreciate that.
That work is so important. And while we know we'll continue to have the systemic issues, when we have solutions like this, it moves us a little bit further in our quest for equity. So congratulations, and continue to do all you can to help, and all of us need to do the same.
And there he is, ladies and gentlemen. His name is David Helene, and he is CEO of Edquity. David, we hope you had a good EdUp experience today. What'd you think?
Really enjoyed it. I enjoyed talking with you both, and also really appreciate both your commitment to equity. So thanks so much for having me, and really appreciate the conversation.
Ladies and gentlemen, you've just EdUp'd. Commencement, the beginning of a new era in higher education, by Kate Colbert and Joe Salustio, with contributions by Elvin Freites, is now available for pre-order on Amazon. Get your Kindle edition or your softbound book. It's going to be
Amazing.